Hello, everyone. Hi. Well, I'm really excited to be with you all today. Thank you so much for coming to hear my talk. Well, a few things I want to disclaim. This is my first time actually giving a talk at Develop. It's my first time giving a talk at this scale. So I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bit nervous, but to save the awkwardness of picturing you in your underwear, I've decided to imagine that you're all avatars in a simulation that I have created to very enthusiastically clap at the end of this talk. So fingers crossed, we'll see how that goes. Well, let's begin speaking about myself. My name is Tara. I'm a lecturer at Goldsmiths University teaching VR and AR theory, design, and development. I'm also in my final write-up year as part of the Intelligence Games and Games Intelligence PhD program. And my thesis looks at embodiment, so the feeling of owning a virtual body in virtual reality, and the technical setup and how that can have effects on psychological effects. I've also worked collaboratively with other research bodies, such as UCL, George Mason University, and their Virginia Serious Games Institute in North Virginia. I've also had the privilege of working as a contractor at Meta, or formerly known as Facebook, looking into elements of social VR. But the core of my research is in embodiment. But this has rippling effects into other interesting areas of research, such as looking at trust and collaboration in social VR settings, looking at medical training in VR, and also looking at believable characters. So what am I doing right now? Well, very exciting things. I'm working with Great Ormond Street Hospital and amazing colleagues at the CVR lab based at Goldsmiths, Dream Reality Studios, and also Buco Studios in a project I like to call VR MCT. I'll give it a moment to land. I always get excited about a new project when I give it a code name. It just makes it feel a bit more real. But I can't discuss too much of that today, but I will be referencing it to discuss some implementation later on in this talk. So the first thing I'd like to do is share a clip from one of my favorite games. Let's see if it will load. One moment. I think I need to connect to the internet. One moment, please. Okay, so it seems like it might not play. I'll continue. So one of my favorite games is LA Noire. I love it because it is arguably one of the best games to come out of Rockstar Games Studios. It's my favorite because it uses facial animation as a mechanic for their gameplay. And I also love the fact that it's based on the backdrop of Los Angeles in the 1940s. So you follow Cole Phelps, who is a newly minted cop, as he progresses into being a detective. But one of the most interesting things about Cole and following his story is that most of the game is set in a third-person perspective. However, when you are investigating and questioning a suspect, the perspective changes from a third person to a first person. And immediately, I feel a bit more control. Immediately, I feel that the next move I'm going to make, the next decision I'm going to make is going to have more of a weighted impact on the gameplay. And then in 2017, Rockstar Games dropped Eleanor into VR. And suddenly, I went from experiencing Cole's achievements and life and progression as a detective from a slightly passive and secondary position to now owning his achievements for myself, to controlling his movements, and therefore being able to experience that 3D world in a more immersive way. So as developers and designers, we have this new ability to now immerse our players into our games in a new way that involves another level of interaction. So in this talk today, I'd like to lead you into the world of virtual agents in VR and how the research that looks at plausibility and immersive gaming can lead to more exciting and engaging experiences. So the outline of my talk is as follows. I want to introduce the medium of VR and why this offers an experience that is different to others. I want to walk through the advancements of agent and avatar immersion techniques in both immersive gaming and medical training to show us how building plausible settings and environments can lead to provoking more stress and provoking more realistic responses from our users. And then I want to end the talk looking at a few principles and practices of what makes a virtual human believable. So, once you wear a headset, you are given 3 superpowers. The first one is 3D stereo vision. Each eye is giving a slightly different set of information, and your brain and eyes work together to produce a world in 3D. Then you have dynamic control of viewpoint, meaning that when I turn my head to look to the side, my field of view changes. This is due to tracking enabled in a head-mounted display, a headset such as the Oculus Quest 2 and the Vive Pro. Then there are sensory motor contingencies, which refer to the actions that we know to carry out in order to perceive the world. The previous example I used of knowing that I want to look to the left, I want to look to the screen, so I know I have to turn my head in order to see that. I can see the stage, I can see the limitations of where I can move and navigate. If I want to look underneath the chair or the table, I know that I have to bend down and navigate myself accordingly. Then the final thing we have is isolated surroundings, meaning that we're completely sealed off into this virtual world with no leakage of the real world. This is important when looking at interacting and engaging with virtual characters, because we're not just looking at them through a 2D screen, which enables us to engage and disengage without much consequence. But now we're able to share a space with them. We're able to become them. And this opens up to another level of engagement that's not available on other platforms. But first, to understand how we can create these believable characters, we first must understand the psychology and how we perceive them in VR. So these are the 4 key illusions of VR, presented by Mel Slater, one of the leading pioneers in VR research. The first one is place illusion, meaning that I am here. I feel like I'm in this virtual environment. The next is plausibility illusion, meaning that I feel that the events that are occurring to me personally are really happening. The next is embodiment illusion, meaning that I feel that the virtual body that I am controlling, that I have, feels like my own. Then we have co-presence, which is a bit of a mix of all of the above. So I feel that I'm here, I feel that the events are happening, I feel that I'm owning this virtual body, but I'm also experiencing that with others in this virtual space. Now, the next example that I will show is going to be using place and plausibility illusion. And I'm choosing this example because it is critical, because we're looking at real life scenarios. And in that, we go into looking at VR medical communication training. In this example, the experiment was looking at child safeguarding. We were looking at whether experience and stress can have an impact on how GPs can recognize and set strategy for domestic abuse being observed towards a child. So in this example, we have a patient coming in for a consultation, and they brought their son with them. What makes this experiment so interesting is that instead of using a head-mounted display, they use something called a CAVE, Cave Automatic Virtual Environment, for short, CAVE. So this is 4 display walls, normally in an empty room. That's 3 walls around and 1 on the floor. And there's projection of these high-resolution images onto these walls. And in order to perceive this world we need in 3D stereo vision, the user would wear a pair of shutter glasses, a pair of middleware. And with these glasses, they'll be able to sync with the graphical display. And in each eye, they're showing a correct image at the correct moment. And this switches about 60 times per second to produce the illusion of 3D stereo vision. Now, this is a perfect example of how place illusion can come into effect, the feeling of being present in VR. So we have our 3D stereo vision, head tracking, so we're able to change our field of view, and we also have the 3D environment. The benefits of using a cave setup is that you're able to have objects from the physical world now coming to add to the plausibility of the scenario. So in this case, we're having a consultation, and the participant is able to access her computer as she would in a real consultation and write up her notes. The downside is that, of course, you're coming into this scenario as yourself. So you can't look at embodiment in a setup like this. The outcome of learning is dependent on provoking real responses from the users. And so we go into the plausibility illusion, the feeling of experiencing a real event in VR. So we're looking at things occurring personally to you. This is dependent on the reactivity of the environment to the participant's actions. So making sure that the participant, every move that the participant makes is being acknowledged in that environment. So looking around, making sure that the environment changes to fit that perspective. Then we have contingent references to elements of the environment to the participant. For example, if the participant speaks to the agent or calls for their attention, what they would expect is that the virtual agent would turn to look and acknowledge the participant. Then we have the credibility of expectation, especially in scenarios like this where we're depending on the transfer of skills from VR to real life. We need to make sure that the context, that the scenario that we're building, it maps out to what the participant is familiar with and would do in that real instance. So participants were really impressed by this experience, and the results show that more stress leads to lower scores given to the medical note, the note in which they wrote how aware they were of the child safeguarding, of the domestic violence or hints of domestic violence, and what strategy they used or has come up with in order to move it to the next stage. So this made them feel stressed, and it made them feel that it challenged them in a really realistic way, and showed us that VR can be used as an effective training tool. But plausibility is a very complex illusion, and it's hard to achieve wholesomely, and it's hard to get back once it's lost. So we move on to another example, which is quite similar, but this is set up in a head-mounted display. In this example, the VR is used as a training tool to help GPs advise patients against taking antibiotics for minor ailments. So this is done in full immersive VR, so using a head-mounted display. And in this example, we see that the participant can have a conversation with two virtual agents, that is the patient and a relative, but also you can see a screen on their virtual desk. And participants complained that they couldn't read the information on the screen, they couldn't interact with the screen as they would in a real life, as they would, and you saw in the previous example, and therefore they started to lose credibility. So it's important when you are setting up looking at building these real life scenarios, that you work with the experts to gain that extra bit of credibility. Because the higher plausibility you're able to build, the more stress is induced, and therefore more realistic responses is able to come out of it. But once again, once you have this plausibility illusion, the effects of it can be positive, but they can also be unexpected. So I want you to imagine for a second that you are in a VR concert. Your favorite band is on, and you're surrounded by a simulated crowd. Now, you see them dancing, so you start to dance. Maybe not so great, but you're enjoying yourself. And then you look to your left and you see an agent, not really dancing, but you feel that they're looking at you, they're staring at you. But when you look at them, they look away. Then you see it is happening a few other times during the experience, and then you mention it to the researcher. But then you realize that this is a simulated crowd. Haven't been programmed to respond to any sort of input from the user. But then we see that the participants are beginning to perceive things that are not there. And this happened in a real study in 2021. So due to their own imagination and own bank of knowledge from their own experiences in this environment, they were able to perceive things that haven't even been programmed to be. So simulating crowds can be difficult. Simulating realistic big environments can be difficult, but it's important to think about these individual contingencies and adapting to personal experiences. So the takeaways is that plausibility and place illusion is important for building realistic, real life scenarios in order to have the transfer of learning and transfer of skills from the VR experience to real life. We also see that it can have unexpected results, and it's important to start thinking about the ways that we can build scenarios that can adapt to individual differences that have been found to be important in that domain. This is positive because as we see this in certain games, we realize that we find different mechanics, we find different ways that we can change the narrative. But then when we come to those places when it starts to negatively impact our users, then we need to think about how we can adapt to these individual contingencies. Finally, of course, we see that VR simulations with virtual agents are useful for training communication skills. Now we come to looking at immersive gaming. Now, I love games like Rec Room and VR Chat, which allows you to enter social VR spaces and interact with friends and family, and even new people that you've never met before. You can come in avatars that are low fidelity, that can represent you or a piece of your identity, or you can go for high fidelity avatars that look more like you or just feel more real. But this phenomenon of owning that body, as we've come to know, is called embodiment. And this is reliant on visuomotor contingencies, which means that you move your hands in real life. Don't know why I'm doing this movement, but it works. You move your hands in real life, and then in VR, you see this mapped onto the movement of the virtual character. And then we have visual perception, which means that you look down and you see an avatar, and it's in alignment spatially to where you are in the physical world. These two things help to create an illusion of embodiment. This was done in 2017 in a study that I did looking at different aspects of agency. So this embodiment could even be provoked using simple, accessible tools such as the Kinect and the Oculus DK2. Now, having this ability to own having the embodiment illusion and being able to change bodies and be immersed in a new identity can have different impact on you. One of them is behavioral, another one is attitudinal, and it can even change your perception. Now, studies have gone to show that embodying a Caucasian-skinned participant in a dark-skinned virtual body can lead to sustained reduction in their implicit racial bias, and even have an effect on how people play the drums in VR. So being in darker-skinned avatars changed their drumming style, became more vibrant. VR has also shown in research that virtually becoming Einstein has improved in cognitive task performance. So it made me think about doing my final Viva in VR, but I guess that's probably not a good idea. So this has been investigated in studies for over a decade. For example, more familiar to, I guess, in games could be the paradigm of the process effect, which is the theory that the look and the movement of a virtual body can have an effect on the behavior within games. So the setup of embodiment can impact how we perceive others. So when we're embodied on these social platforms and we're able to speak to each other, we can still evaluate and notice when someone is engaged in our conversation or not. We're very sensitive to nonverbal communication. For example, I did a study that looked at the impact of consistent and inconsistent representations of players in VR during a collaborative task and its effect on trust. So I did it in two studies, one with a confederate, meaning that someone was asked to pretend to be a participant, and then in the other study was done in pairs. So they were asked to play a game, building blocks or models that they can see, and then I measured trust objectively using the social dilemma game, the investment game, where the amount of money they give is equivalent to how much trust they have in the participant or the other player to give back in the same to increase their final amount. Now, what we found was quite interesting in this first study. So the results showed that when the confederate, so the person pretending to be a participant, didn't have an avatar, they were trusted more, they were given more. And that was strange. So when we did it again in a paired study, we saw that effect disappear. So what we found was, of course, the confederate was showing deception, was being deceptive, I should say. But it was interesting that even facing a relatively rudimentary avatar, with little to no experience, participants were able to pick up on a leakage of social cues of deception. Now, the challenge here is that these rules of engagement, I should say, are hard to define. Most of these things happen on a very subconscious level. So now how do we now translate this over to interacting with a virtual agent? Now, the CVR Lab has begun to try and tackle this issue in creating AI characters in the upcoming Peaky Blinders game. In this work, they collaborated with two game studios, so Dream Reality Interactive and Maze Theory. And this was led by Christina, another student on the IGGY program. So what they did was to try and use a machine learning pipeline to detect and define social attitudes in VR games. So what they did first was that volunteers took part in a social interaction with a virtual character in virtual reality. Next, an expert was asked to annotate that social interaction within virtual reality. And they did this by replaying the interaction and labeling it, and labeling the data. So they trained a reinforcement learning algorithm, proximal policy optimization, or PPO, which involved collecting a small bunch of experiences, interacting with the environment, and using that batch to update the decision-making policy. And the rewards were based on an imitation learning algorithm, generative adversarial imitation learning. So using the raw data, so the head movement, and also socially meaningful psychologically based features such as derived data, such as how close we are to the virtual character or how much times we tend to look at them, they compared different machine learning configurations, including pre-training and long short-term memory. And they were able to establish real-time detection of user engagement with this new data. So when they went back in and had another interaction with a virtual character, the agent was able to label the different social engagement cues. So the pre-training and long short-term memory configuration using derived data over raw performed the best with 83% accuracy. The models using raw data did not generalize. Overall, this work introduces an immersive machine learning pipeline to detect social engagement and demonstrates how creatives can use machine learning and virtual reality to expand their ability to design more engaging experiences. Given the pipeline's results for social engagement detection, we generalize it for detecting human-defined social attributes. So what do we take away? Well, virtual humans can help us understand nonverbal communication and subtle attributes of social interaction in VR. And machine learning and VR can expand the ability to design more engaging experiences. So we move on to our final section here. So what makes a virtual character believable? As we've seen in previous segments, creating a believable virtual character is not just about visual fidelity, it's not just about avatar motion, and it's not just about avatar interaction. It's about finding the balance between these three aspects. Now, Glenn Entis provided us with a graph to kind of show the relationship between visual fidelity and motion fidelity. So you see that the more we go up in visual fidelity, the higher expectation there is for motion fidelity. And Mario Bros and Pixar do very well in establishing that balance. But then if you don't, you fall beneath that line into this zombie area where the characters are completely unbelievable. I'm sure you can think of one or two in your own experiences, but we're thinking perhaps, as an example, high fidelity avatar with using keyframe animation to animate that. So the question is, do we throw all this sensory input into our development? Do we go for the most high range immersive setups to create a believable character? Is that the only way for a person to feel that they're speaking to a believable character? Well, at my time when I was contracting with Meta, we took a look at this idea of what makes a character believable, focusing more on facial animation, as we're more sensitive to things going on in the face than how our body moves. So what we did was that we asked participants to listen to a presentation from a virtual character. And they were given a budget so that at predefined intervals during the presentation, they will have an interrupt where they can use that budget to change the factors: eye gaze, eye blinking, mouth animation, and micro expressions. That this happened 7 times, and in each of those times, the data, so what they chose to change, whether to put one higher or move it lower, was recorded and put into a Markov chain model, which is used to predict the sequence of possibilities of certain behavior or results, depending on the state that there was before, that state of results before. Now, what we found was that the whole budget wasn't necessary to reach a point where the participants felt that they were speaking to a believable character. So they reached an equilibrium before maxing out their budget. And also, we found that the mouth animation and eye blinking were the factors that were required, at least at a level 1, in order for participants to feel that they were speaking to a believable character. This was an interesting way, interesting framework, as usually we, as developers or designers, normally are the ones to impose what we feel is the most important, let's say, attributes of facial animation to seem like we're talking to a believable character. But it's interesting that with this framework, we were able to put that into the user's hands to inform us of what they feel is important. These results, of course, should be taken more in a local sense than global, as this is very dependent on the animation set up for each of the factors and the factors themselves and the context. But it goes to show that a framework like this can be useful. And more current research has taken the human interruption and switched it for an AI agent. So instead of the participant changing the factors, an AI agent changes the factors and asks the participants if they want to keep it or lose it, continuously increasing the learning of that AI agent to the preference of the user. So perhaps that is more in line with how this can become more useful in future. So where has this led me? So in my study that is ongoing right now, I am looking at VR medical communication training and specific techniques of embodiment that lead to having more an interesting way of self-assessment. Again, I can't speak too much about it, but we have come to a point where we've begun to look at how we can create a believable agent. So the first thing, of course, is to choose the right avatar. From what we've seen today, we know that we're building a real-life scenario in virtual reality, and we want the participants to feel that they're speaking to someone that they would see in a consultation that they usually have in real life. So we chose to go for the Microsoft Rocketbox avatars because they provide high-fidelity models with a wide range of skin tones and professions. And then they also have blend shapes enabled for facial tracking. Then we have to think about how we're going to animate this virtual character. So again, if we go back to the graph that shows the balance of VR of motion fidelity and visual fidelity, we know that as we're going up in visual fidelity, we have to match it with the motion. So we chose to use a motion capture system to capture the movement of our avatar. So we use the OptiTrack motion capture system at Goldsmiths University, and we also had 12 Flex 3 motion capture cameras, and we used a marker set of 37 to capture the full body movement. And we also captured audio at the same time using the Rode wireless mic. Then we move on to facial tracking. Again, we wanted to be able to have a more expressive virtual character. So we chose to use the Live Capture Unity plugin, which gave us access to the ARKit library, which allowed us to map the ARKit blend shapes to the blend shapes on the Microsoft Rocketbox characters. So along with the connection to the accompanying face capture mobile app, we were able to stream straight into Unity the facial movements for our avatar. Unfortunately, this is only available currently, I believe, on iOS. So now we have the facial animation, we have the motion of the full body captured as well, and we also have the audio. But then how do we put this all together? So what we did was that we had 3 different lines of media coming in. So we have to set a manager of sorts for each one so that once we begin recording, everyone records at the same time. Another alternative to cut down on the kind of pipeline is to stream data straight from OptiTrack into Unity 3D using the Unity integration plugin. This is very interesting because you can immediately see how your animation looks on your avatar and record from Unity itself. You can also experience this as embodiment. So you are able to also use a head-mounted display in this experience so that you're moving and you're also seeing the movement in VR on your body at the same time. But this wasn't in the scope for this experiment, and we left it out. And then we moved into Unity. And with our data, we cut and change that into a humanoid rig so that we can use it with Unity's mechanism system to create a state machine. When you have your motion capture data, there may be a process of cleaning that might be required, and we've been lucky enough to work with Buko Studios to help us with that. But once we have that data, then we're able to create a system to move between the different animations. Now, we don't have finger movement because the OptiTrack does not pick up on these small movements. However, you can use keyframe animation to add in small movements to the hands when necessary and layer that on top of the animation that you've captured in the motion capture system. Alternatively, we can layer also the facial and body animation in our state machine to play simultaneously, or you can combine that in a 3D modeling system, so it's only one file. The result, unfortunately, needs to remain a mystery, unless you choose to help me with this, pilot this study. But this showed the final result of all of the data that we collected into a virtual character. So where is this going? This is all great news because the upcoming headsets that we have are beginning to include all these exciting multisensory input and feedback, such as haptics, gaze, lip sync, and even being able to use perceptive changing because of the headsets and embodiment. So what we found in the previous studies, for example, the importance of having mouth animation and eye blinking is now accessible to us to enable us to have more expressive responses in social VR platforms. So this is interesting for both research and development, as now we can start to play around to how to create more expressive interactions and more realistic interactions. And the more we know about how this impacts social interaction, the more we can feed into how we can create more believable characters. And that cycle continues to impact each other. So the conclusions are that place and plausibility is important for providing realistic and sometimes unexpected results. This can be positive in allowing us to find new mechanics and new ways to navigate our narratives, but they can also negatively impact our experiences, and therefore it might be interesting to start to look at how we can adapt to individual differences that's relevant to that domain, especially when that participant is familiar with that scenario. Also, that skill transfer is important for skill transfer in real life. So the learning is dependent on being able to provoke a realistic response from the user. And we also see that virtual humans can help us to understand nonverbal communication and subtle attributes of social VR, and that machine learning and VR can expand the ability to design more engaging experiences. Thank you so much. Right, any questions? It's really unfortunate you didn't get to see the videos. They were quite interesting. Or maybe that can be shown in another time. Yes?
So you mentioned that people perceive things that aren't there.
Yes.
You talk about issues of trust with characters. And then you put that together with the fact that VR can alter behavior. I find it amazing that a darker skin color can make you beat a drum more groovily. I think that's really cool. is there space of putting those things together, and maybe somebody else is doing this, in terms of things like therapy and rehabilitation, where you're showing people themselves as something different in order to get them to understand, say, a different viewpoint or a different way of thinking?
Absolutely. There's a lot of research in embodiment and perspective changing that is aligned with therapy. For example, there was a study where participants were able to have a therapy session with Sigmund Freud. And what happened that made it interesting is that this wasn't a character that was automated or set with pre-programmed responses, but the user could actually switch perspectives and ask themselves that question as that therapist. And that showed they had a more positive response to therapy because of that. So there is a very powerful impact that embodiment and perspective changing can have, especially, like you said, when we put all these attributes together.
Thanks. A brilliant talk as well.
Thank you.
Hi, this is my second question on sort of VR and metaverse stuff in the last two talks, actually, funny enough. So I'm a VR chat person. I spent 2 years in VR chat now. And I've got a number of good friends who utilize a lot of the technology you're showing off there for social interaction within VR now, particularly the Vive Pro Eye and the facial tracking extension combination. And I'm wondering if you've taken any time to research the dynamic social interaction that's occurred in places like, particularly in the places that push the technology a lot more like VRC, but also Neos VR. And if that's informed any of your research, and if it's given you any inspiration for further research in the field.
At the moment, I personally haven't done any studies that look at specifically those platforms, but it is a space, like you mentioned, that could be very interesting to go into in future.
Thank you. On the topic of embodiment, that particularly interests me. As a trans woman, I often feel like the body that I inhabit currently isn't my own in and of itself, which is a challenge. And I find VR a nice escape from that in some cases. Would you say that there's anything in particular that you would bear in mind when you're developing a VR experience with putting someone in a body that is not just theirs, but the body that they are most comfortable in? Are there any considerations that you would be putting into place for that?
Very good question. I feel that the considerations is very reliant on the context of that platform. So, for example, I showed Rec Room, right? So some platforms deal with different fidelities of avatar representation, and also the types of avatars. So not always using humanoid avatars as well. So I guess it depends really on the platform that you're entering. So in consideration with the avatars you create, making sure that they are suitable for that platform, and the users that are coming onto that platform, I guess, is the most important consideration to make. And giving the participant the tools to customize their avatars in a way that reflects their identity. So kind of expanding on that content creation side of things.
Hi. One of the things I've come in contact with in the past is when you are using something like VR for training purposes, and I mean, this is just me being a game designer by trade, there's a sort of mischievousness to playful behavior. And obviously, like when you're doing, for example, medical training, you want to limit that. And is there anything that's come out of VR avatar design that sets that tone or changes people's mindset out of playful into just explorative?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, that was one of the videos that I was trying to show. But you're exactly right. There is a sense of playfulness that can sometimes occur because we can't control what people do when they're faced with, let's say, a non-playable character, for example. We don't know what they're going to try and do to interact with them. And that's why the last study that I showed in creating a model in which to allow and to see how engaged we are with a character can now be used in games to kind of simulate that more reaction to those responses of playfulness. But when we are looking at lab studies and in-game studies, it's a slightly different way to go about it. In lab studies, you can have more moderation. So you can tell your participants that, keep your hands here, look this way, et cetera, and et cetera. And most of the time, than not, they adhere to that. They follow that instruction because they know they're in experiment. But then when you come out of that and you're in play or you're in a more exploratory space, then they start to do a bit more things. But what you can do is use affordances, use cues to kind of lead the player back into the line of the narration. There's a lot of games that do that quite nicely with diegetic UI and etc. to kind of lead the player back into what they're supposed to be doing. Or the non-playable character, you'll see in some games, they say, well, they start talking or doing some, when you start being too idle in a game, they're trying to remind you to get back on track. So there's a few techniques that can be used to not necessarily control the person, but to lead them back into the kind of main narrative or the main instruction that you want them to do. But in lab studies, you have a bit more control over that due to it being an experiment. Okay, it seems that time is up, but I'll be standing here for a while, so if you have any questions, feel free to come up to me and we can have a chat. Thank you so much.